There's a kind of quiet that only exists a few feet above open ocean. The two Allison engines fill the cockpit with a steady roar, but past the glass, there is nothing. No horizon worth the name, no landmark, no radio, because the radios are switched off and will stay off. Just the gray Pacific sliding underneath the twin booms of a P-38 Lightning at 50 feet, close enough that a careless twitch of the stick would put the propellers into the water. Rex Barber flies with his eyes moving, left to the man on his wing, forward to the empty sea, down to the compass, then to the watch strapped where he can read it. He has been in the air almost 2 hours, and he has seen nothing but salt water the entire time. Somewhere ahead, if the arithmetic holds, if a squadron commander from Mississippi has done the impossible with a ship's compass and a stopwatch, there's a Japanese bomber carrying the most important man in the enemy's navy. And Barber, and 15 other American pilots, have come more than 400 miles across the water to make sure that man never lands. They do not know yet which of them will fire the shots that matter. They do not know that one of them will spend the rest of his life being told he did not do the thing he did. They only know the target is close, and that if the timing is wrong by even a few minutes, they will have flown to the far edge of their fuel for nothing, over the most heavily defended stretch of sky in the South Pacific, and they will have to turn around and fly all the way back on the little that remains. Then a voice breaks the silence. 2 words on the radio from a pilot who has spotted specks in the haze ahead and to the right. Bogies. 11 o'clock. Hi. They are exactly on time. This is the story of the longest fighter interception of the Second World War. It is the story of how the United States read the enemy's mail, learned that one man would be in a certain place at a certain minute, and sent 16 fighters to the far end of their range to take his life out of the sky. It is a story of navigation so precise it still reads like fiction, of a gamble with the war's most precious secret, and of a death that changed the shape of the Pacific War. But it is mostly the story of what happened after the guns went quiet, because 2 men came home from that mission and both said the same thing. I am the one who brought down Yamamoto. Only one of them was telling the whole truth, and the United States Army Air Forces, and the service that grew out of it, spent the next 50 years unable or unwilling to say which one. The wronged man farmed potatoes in Oregon and carried the argument to his grave. The other man told his version on magazine covers and in front of crowds until the day he died. And the record, the official record, the one carved in the government's own files, still splits the difference right down the middle as if the truth were something you could cut in half and hand to 2 men. We're going to lay all of it out. The evidence for one pilot, the evidence for the other, the wreckage in the jungle, the autopsy. The Japanese Navy quietly rewrote, the testimony of the one enemy escort pilot who lived to talk about it, and the ruling by a man who sat on the official board that got it wrong, a man who changed his mind in public only recently. And at the end, we are going to hand you the verdict, not because we are afraid to state it, because you have earned the right to weigh it yourself. Before we climb into that cockpit, a small thing that means a great deal on this channel. If you care about getting the aircraft right, the markings right, the ranks right, and the record straight, then you are exactly who we make these for. Subscribe and stay to the end, because the last third of this story is where the real fight is, and it is not the one over Bougainville. And when we get to the men who flew this mission, tell us in the comments if your father or your grandfather served with the 13th Air Force or the 339th Fighter Squadron or flew Lightnings anywhere in the Solomons. Those men are getting harder to find every year, and their stories belong here. Now, let us start with the man in the bomber and why 16 Americans wanted him dead badly enough to bet the war on it. Isoroku Yamamoto was born on April 4th, 1884, in the snow country of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture. He came into the world as Isoroku Takano, and the name Isoroku is itself a small piece of history because in the old counting it meant 56, the age of his father when the boy was born. He was later adopted into the Yamamoto family, as was the custom, and took their name. He grew up poor, disciplined, and brilliant, and he went to sea. At the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese Navy shattered a Russian fleet and announced to the world that a new power had arrived in the Pacific, the young Yamamoto was aboard a cruiser. He was wounded there. An exploding gun took 2 fingers from his left hand. For the rest of his life, the geisha of the entertainment districts had a nickname for him, a joke about the missing fingers, and Yamamoto wore the injury the way a soldier wears a decoration, as proof that he had been there when it counted. Here's the part that made him so dangerous and so tragic in American eyes. Yamamoto knew the United States. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served twice as a naval attaché in Washington. He had driven across the American continent, seen the oil fields of Texas and the auto plants of Detroit, and he had done the arithmetic that so many of his colleagues refused to do. He understood, better than almost any man in the Japanese high command, that America was an industrial giant that could not be beaten in a long war. He had said as much, plainly, more than once. He is supposed to have warned that he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that after that he had no confidence. And yet, when the decision for war came, it was Yamamoto who planned the blow that started it. It was Yamamoto who conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor, the strike that, on December 7th, 1941, sank the battleships and dragged the United States into the war. It was Yamamoto who planned the Midway operation the following summer, the gamble that cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers and the strategic initiative in a single day. He had been commander-in-chief of the combined fleet since 1939, and to the American public, and to the men fighting in the islands, he was not a reluctant admiral who had warned against the war. He was the face of Pearl Harbor. He was the architect. He was the man who had started it. There's a bitter irony in all of this that the men who wanted him dead did not know and probably would not have cared about. Yamamoto had been, for years, one of the strongest voices in Japan against war with the United States. As a younger officer, he had argued against the alliance with Nazi Germany. He had made enemies among the hardline nationalists at home, so many enemies that the Navy at one point sent him to sea partly to keep him safe from assassination by his own countrymen. He was a gambler by temperament, a man who loved cards and shogi and long odds, and he had gambled his career on the belief that if war came, Japan's only hope was a single crushing blow before American industry could wake up. Pearl Harbor was that blow. He had designed it not because he wanted the war, but because he believed it was the only way his country could survive one it was going to fight anyway. None of that softened him in American eyes. To the men in the Pacific, he was simply the enemy commander, the brain behind the fleet, and the sooner he was gone, the better. But it is worth knowing, when you watch his bomber go down, that the man inside it had seen this ending coming more clearly than almost anyone in Tokyo. So when a chance came to take him out of the sky, there was never really a question of whether. The only questions were how and at what cost. And the cost was the biggest secret the United States possessed. The Americans were reading the Japanese Navy's mail. The main Japanese naval code, the one the codebreakers called JN-25, had been penetrated by the cryptographers and linguists of the Pacific Fleet's intelligence apparatus. It was the same advantage that had won Midway. It was, quite literally, the most valuable secret in the Pacific, worth more than any ship, any island, any general. And on April 13th, 1943, that secret delivered a gift that was almost too good to use. A message went out over the Japanese naval circuits, addressed to the commanders of the bases in the Northern Solomons. It laid out, in careful detail, an inspection tour that the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet would make in 5 days' time. It gave the date, it gave the places, and it gave the times, down to the minute. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0600 hours. He would travel in a medium attack bomber escorted by 6 fighters. He would arrive at his first stop at 0800 hours. The message read like a train timetable, and the American cryptographers, at their stations at Pearl Harbor and elsewhere, decrypted it within a day. The intelligence officers who read it understood immediately what they were holding. One of them, Edwin Layton, the fleet intelligence officer, had actually known Yamamoto personally before the war, had dined with him, had spoken with him in Tokyo. He carried the decrypt to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, and told him what it meant. Here was the enemy's most important admiral, a man famous for his punctuality, about to fly a fixed route on a fixed schedule, straight through the outer edge of American fighter range. And here we come to the first trial inside the story, the first question you have to weigh. Because to kill Yamamoto, the Americans would have to act on a decrypted message. And if they acted, if a flight of fighters just happened to appear at the exact spot and the exact minute where the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet was passing, the Japanese might well ask themselves a terrible question. How did the enemy know? They might conclude that their codes were broken. And if they changed those codes, the United States would lose the single greatest advantage it had in the entire Pacific War, an advantage that was saving thousands of American lives. This was not a small worry. It was raised at the highest levels. The historian R. Cargill Hall, in the definitive scholarly volume on this mission, documents that Winston Churchill himself was troubled by the risk, and that British intelligence questioned whether killing one admiral was worth gambling the code-breaking secret. There is a popular story that President Franklin Roosevelt personally ordered his Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, to get Yamamoto, It is a good story. It may even be true. But I want to be honest with you the way this channel is always honest with you. There is no surviving official document that proves Roosevelt gave that order. The sources disagree on whether he was even involved. What the record does show is that the decision was pushed down to the men in the Pacific. Knox left it largely to Nimitz. Nimitz consulted Admiral William Halsey, who commanded in the South Pacific. And the risk to the code was managed with a cover story, a fiction that Australian coast watchers had spotted a senior officer boarding a plane, a lie prepared in advance to explain how the Americans had known. Sit with that decision for a moment, because it is heavier than it looks. The men who ran the war in the Pacific chose to spend a piece of their most precious secret, knowingly to kill one man. They decided that the death of Yamamoto was worth the risk of losing the ability to read the enemy's plans, and they hedged that bet with a lie. They prepared in advance a false explanation. If anyone asked how the fighters had found the Admiral, the answer would be that Australian coast watchers, the brave men hidden in the jungle who reported Japanese movements by radio, had spotted a senior officer boarding an aircraft at Rabaul. It was not true, but it was believable, and it protected the code. And in the event, it seems to have worked because the Japanese never did trace the interception back to their own broken cipher. That is the kind of cold, deliberate calculation that wins wars. And it is worth remembering that it was made by men sitting in offices, weighing one life against thousands and choosing. So the decision was made. Nimitz authorized the mission on April 17th, the day before. Now someone had to actually do it, and that meant solving a problem that looked, on paper, close to impossible. The interception point was on the far side of the American fighter cordon, near the southern tip of Bougainville, close to the big Japanese airbase at Kahili. In a straight line, it was roughly 400 miles from the American fighter strips on Guadalcanal. The historian John Curatola of the National World War II Museum puts the distance to the planned interception point at 435 miles. And a straight line was exactly what the Americans could not fly, because a straight line would take them over Japanese-held islands, past Japanese radar and Japanese coast watchers, and would announce their coming long before they arrived. To keep the surprise, they would have to swing wide out over open water, a great curving dogleg to the south and west, and that route stretched the outbound leg to something like 600 miles. The round trip would run close to 1,000 miles. No fighter based on Guadalcanal could make that flight and still have fuel to fight, except one. The Navy and Marine Wildcats and Corsairs simply did not have the legs. Only the Army Air Forces had the answer, and it was the twin-engine, twin-boom, Lockheed P-38 Lightning. On this mission, the specific aircraft were P-38G models, the variant in frontline service in the South Pacific in the spring of 1943, and even the Lightning could not do it on internal fuel alone. It would need drop tanks and big ones. Here is a detail the men who watch this channel will appreciate, because it is the kind of thing that decides missions and never makes the movies. The Lightnings normally carried a pair of 165-gallon drop tanks. For this flight, that was not enough. A limited number of much larger 330-gallon ferry tanks were rushed up from New Guinea. Each fighter would carry one of the big 330-gallon tanks under one wing and a standard 165-gallon tank under the other. That put roughly 1,000 extra pounds on one side of the airplane, an ugly, lopsided load, but the tanks sat close enough to the center of the aircraft that the pilots could live with it. Without those tanks, there is no mission. It is worth remembering that the longest fighter interception of the war turned, in part, on whether enough fuel tanks could be flown to the right island in time. The mission fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, part of the 13th Air Force, flying from the strip on Guadalcanal, the men called Fighter II. Though the 339th carried the mission on its books, the pilots were drawn from across the group, from the 12th and the 70th Squadrons as well, the best long-range Lightning men available, and the man chosen to lead it was Major John Mitchell. I want to stop on this name because it is the name that history has treated worst of all, and because there is a confusion I need to clear up before we go further. The man who led Operation Vengeance was Major John William Mitchell, born in 1915, a farmer's son from Enid, Mississippi. He is not, and this matters, he is not General William Mitchell, the famous Billy Mitchell, the air power prophet who was court-martialed in the 1920s and who died in 1936, 7 years before this mission ever flew. Same last name, no relation. If you take one small fact from this section, let it be that the two Mitchells are different men, because you will see them confused, and the man who navigated this mission deserves to be known by his own name. John Mitchell was handed the hardest piece of the entire operation. He had to get 16 fighters from Guadalcanal to a point in the sky near Bougainville, arriving within a couple of minutes of a bomber whose schedule he knew only from a decrypted message, flying a roundabout route over featureless ocean at wave-top height in complete radio silence with no navigational aids of any kind, no radar to guide him, no radio beacon, nothing but a compass, an airspeed, and a watch. He threw out the flight plan that the fighter command staff handed him. A Marine operations officer named John Condon had worked one up, but Mitchell judged the airspeeds and the timing wrong for what he needed, and he sat down and computed his own. He worked backward from the moment of interception. He wanted to arrive, not when Yamamoto's bomber was cruising high and fast, but as it descended toward its landing, slow and low and vulnerable. He asked for a naval ship's compass to be installed in his Lightning, because the standard aircraft compass was not good enough for the dead reckoning he was about to attempt, and a Marine officer had one fitted the day before the flight. The route he drew was a thing of grim beauty. From Guadalcanal, the first leg ran on a heading of 265 degrees for 183 miles. The second leg turned to 290 degrees for 88 miles. The third leg swung to 305 degrees for 125 miles. Then a final short turn to the northeast to close on the Bougainville coast. Each leg flown at around 200 miles per hour, each leg over empty water, each leg at no more than 50 feet above the waves, and some accounts say Mitchell tried to hold it closer to 30. Down there, below the radar, below the horizon of any watching island, 16 fighters would slip in like a knife. Mitchell himself, when it was over, is said to have reckoned the odds of even making contact at something like 1,000 to 1. Think about what he was being asked to do. Fly 2 hours over open ocean with no reference, hit a point in empty sky, and arrive at the same minute as an enemy who might be early, might be late, might change his plans, might not come at all. And if the fuel ran short, there was no friendly field within reach. There was only the sea. Mitchell had one attempt, no second try, and the penalty for a small error compounded over 2 hours was a squadron of dead men in the water and a secret possibly blown for nothing. Every heading had to be held within a degree or two. Every turn had to come at the right second. Every pilot had to hold formation on the deck, where a moment's inattention drops you into the waves, for the length of time it takes to watch a feature film. And the man leading them was navigating by the same tools a sailing captain would have recognized 100 years earlier: a compass, a watch, a known speed, and faith in his own arithmetic. When people ask me what the hardest thing about this mission was, they expect me to say the dogfight. It was not the dogfight, it was getting there. The fight lasted a couple of minutes. The navigation was the miracle, and it lasted 2 hours. And it is the part almost nobody tells. 18 Lightnings took off from Fighter 2, beginning around 0725 hours on the morning of April 18th, 1943. Almost at once, the arithmetic of the mission began to bite. One pilot, taking off heavily loaded, blew a tire and could not go. A second found that his drop tanks would not feed fuel to the engines, and a fighter that cannot draw from its tanks cannot make a 1,000-mile flight. Both of these aborts came from the small group of pilots designated to make the actual attack, and their places were filled by two others, Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine. So of the 18 that started, 16 flew the mission. Remember that number, 16 men. It will matter when we come to the argument, because only a handful of them were in position to fire at the bombers, and the fight over who did what has never fully ended. For 2 hours, they flew Mitchell's route. Nobody spoke. The formation stayed low and loose over the water, the big, lopsided drop tanks dragging at the wings, the pilots fighting the boredom and the tension that come together on a long overwater flight when any one of 100 small failures means you do not come home. Mitchell watched his compass in his watch and made his turns on the second. And at the far end of it, at the moment he had calculated days before on the ground, he began his climb toward the coast of Bougainville. Now here's the thing that still raises the hair on the back of my neck when I read the accounts, and I have read a great many of them. Mitchell had planned to reach the interception point at 0935 hours. He arrived at 0934, 1 minute early. After 2 hours of dead reckoning over open ocean, with no instruments to help him, he hit his mark within a single minute. And as the Lightnings climbed toward the green wall of the island, someone looked up and to the right and saw them. 2 bombers, 6 fighters above and behind, right where the decrypted message said they would be, right when it said they would be there. The Japanese called the bomber the Type 1 land attack aircraft. To the Americans, it was the Betty, the Mitsubishi medium bomber with the fat, cigar-shaped fuselage that the Japanese crews grimly nicknamed the Flying Lighter because its unprotected fuel tanks caught fire so easily. There were 2 of them that morning, flying in a loose formation at around 6,500 feet, Escorting them were 6 Zeros, the nimble fighters stacked above and behind, watching for exactly the kind of threat that was now clawing up out of the sea toward them. Let me stop here for one detail, for the fact checkers, because I know you are out there and because getting this right is the whole reason this channel exists. If you ever see this mission illustrated, look at the star on the wing of those Lightnings. On the 18th of April, 1943, the American national marking was a plain white star inside a blue circle. That is all. There were no white bars running out to either side, and there was no border around it. The bars that most people picture when they think of an American warplane, the star and bar, did not exist yet. They were not introduced until late June of 1943, more than 2 months after this mission flew, and the red outline that came with them was replaced by a blue one that August. So a Lightning over Bougainville in April wears the plain star and the blue disc, and nothing else. If you see one painted with the bars, someone got the date wrong. That is exactly the kind of thing this audience catches. And you're right to catch it, and we are going to get it right. And here, the Americans hit their first surprise. They had planned for 1 bomber. The message had spoken of the commander-in-chief traveling in a medium attack plane. Nobody had told them there would be 2, which meant that the killer flight, the small group assigned to make the kill, did not know which bomber carried Yamamoto. They would have to go after both. Mitchell took the covering flight and climbed hard, driving up toward 18,000 feet, positioning to take on the Zeros and to block any reinforcements that might come boiling up from the big base at Kahili, where the Americans knew dozens of enemy fighters were sitting. That was the whole shape of the plan. The top cover would hold off the swarm. The killer flight would go for the bombers. Everything now depended on 4 men, and within seconds, it depended on 2, because the mission almost came apart at the worst possible moment. The killer flight was Tom Lanphier, Rex Barber, Besby Holmes, and Raymond Hine. As they turned to attack and reached down to release their now empty drop tanks so they could fight clean, Holmes found that his tanks would not let go. A fighter cannot go into a turning fight dragging a pair of half-ton tanks under its wings, and so Holmes turned away, out toward the sea, struggling with the release, and his wingman Hine went with him to guard his tail. In an instant, half the killer flight was gone from the fight. That left Lanphier and Barber, 2 American fighters against 2 bombers, and 6 alerted Zeros that were already dropping their own tanks and nosing over to attack. What happened in the next 60 seconds is the thing that men argued about for the rest of their lives. Here is what is not in dispute. 1 Betty went down in the jungle of southern Bougainville, trailing fire and heavy black smoke, and slammed into the trees. It was the lead bomber. It carried Admiral Yamamoto. The 2nd Betty was driven down onto the water off the coast and crashed into the sea. It carried Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, who somehow survived the crash. 2 bombers left the sky. Both admirals were shot down. The mission succeeded beyond anyone's hope. Around and above all of this, the rest of the fight boiled. Mitchell in the top cover, climbing hard, had positioned themselves to take on the Zeros and to watch the sky over Kahili, where at any moment a swarm of fresh enemy fighters could have come up and turned a clean ambush into a slaughter. That swarm never came in time, and that too is part of why the mission worked. The whole engagement, from the first sighting to the last bomber going down, lasted only a few minutes. A morning of 2 hours of flying, weeks of intelligence work, a gamble with the nation's deepest secret, all of it spent in a fight that was over almost before it began. And in those few minutes, both Bettys fell, 1 American did not come home, and the seeds of a 50-year argument were planted in the confusion. The question, the only question, is who fired the burst that sent Yamamoto's bomber into the jungle? Let me give you the 2 accounts, as fairly as I can give them, because that is the whole point of this exercise. You are the jury. You need to hear both. Tom Lanphier's account went like this. As the Zeros dove on the 2 Americans, Lanphier turned up and into them to break up their attack, and in the head-on pass, he shot the wing off one of the diving Zeros. Then, having disrupted the escort, he rolled up and over, came back down, and saw the lead bomber below him, running for the trees. He said he cut across it at a sharp angle, a difficult 90-degree deflection shot, and fired a long burst that tore the right wing off the Betty and sent it flaming into the jungle. That was his claim. He had killed a Zero, then killed Yamamoto's bomber in the space of a few seconds. And it was Lanphier who broke radio silence on the way home, crowing over the airwaves that the man would not be dictating any peace terms now, a reckless transmission that could have told any listening Japanese station exactly what had just happened and why. And it was Lanphier who, when the fighters landed back at Guadalcanal, put in the first and loudest claim. Rex Barber's account went like this, Barber never went after the Zeros at all. As Lanphier turned up into the escort, Barber banked hard to the right and dropped in directly behind the two bombers. He lost sight of them for an instant behind his own engine cowling, and when they reappeared, he was almost on top of one, dead astern. He opened fire into it from close range and from directly behind, walking his rounds into the right engine, the fuselage, the tail. When his fire chewed into the left engine, the Betty poured black smoke, rolled violently to the left, and went down so suddenly that Barber had to yank his fighter aside to avoid the debris. He saw a column of smoke rise from the jungle. Then he turned and went after the second bomber, the one over the water, where Holmes, tanks finally gone, had rejoined the fight. Barber came home with his Lightning shot through in more than 100 places. 104 holes by the count that has come down to us, some of them from that second bomber's own gunner, some from the debris. 2 men, 2 stories. Both say, I brought down the lead, Betty. Both cannot be right, because there was only one lead Betty and only one Admiral Yamamoto inside it. Now, for most of the years after the war, the version the public heard was Lanphier's. And there is a reason for that, and the reason is not that his evidence was better. It is that he told it louder and first, and he was in a position to shape the record. Lanphier, by several accounts, wrote up the official report of the action himself. He wrote the recommendations for the decorations. And in the decades that followed, he told his story in magazine articles, including a widely read piece in a national magazine in the 1960s, under a title that claimed the kill outright. The early books largely followed him. For a generation, if you knew one name attached to the death of Yamamoto, it was Thomas Lanphier. I want to pause here, because this is the moment where this story stops being about airplanes and starts being about something every one of you has felt. You have watched it happen. 2 people do a job. One of them does the hard, quiet, dangerous part, the part with the real risk in it. The other is better with words, better with a room, faster to the boss's ear. And when the credit is handed out, it goes to the one who talked, not the one who did. It happens in offices and on job sites and in every organization human beings have ever built. What makes this case different is only the scale. The job was killing the man who planned Pearl Harbor, and the credit was a permanent line in the history of a nation. But the shape of it, the ache of it, is something you already know in your bones, so let us do the thing the record makers should have done at the start. Let us look at the evidence, not the volume of the claims, the evidence. Start with the wreck itself. Yamamoto's Betty came down in the jungle and stayed there, and the Japanese reached it, and in the years since, investigators have examined what remained, and the physical evidence tells a consistent story. The bullet and cannon damage on that bomber entered from behind. The fatal fire came from a stream of rounds fired into the aircraft from dead astern, from the 6 o'clock position, precisely the attack that Barber described flying, and precisely not the sharp side on deflection shot that Lanphier claimed. The right wing that Lanphier said he shot off in the air was found lying close beside the fuselage in the wreckage, consistent with a wing torn away when the aircraft struck the trees, not one blasted off in flight and fluttering down somewhere else. Now the body. When the Japanese recovered Admiral Yamamoto, a post-mortem examination found 2 bullet wounds. One had entered the back of his left shoulder, the other had entered under his lower left jaw and exited above his right eye. Both were consistent with fire coming from behind into the side of the aircraft, from a fighter sitting on the bomber's tail. I have to be careful and honest here in the way this channel promises to be. The Japanese Navy quietly altered the official medical report. Yamamoto's biographer, Hiroyuki Agawa, records that the findings were massaged on orders from above, because the truth of how their revered admiral died was not something the high command wished to circulate. So I will not tell you the autopsy is courtroom proof. I will tell you that the wounds that were recorded point backward, toward a fighter firing from astern, and that this matches Barber and not Lanphier. Then there is the witness. Of the 6 Zero pilots who escorted the bombers that morning, only one lived through the rest of the war. His name was Kenji Yanagiya. In the decades afterward, he spoke about what he had seen, and even attended a reunion with the American pilots. And his account of the attack on the lead bomber matched a fighter coming in from behind, and matched Lanphier having turned away toward the escort rather than making the kill. The enemy's own surviving eyewitness, with no reason to favor one American over another, described the attack the way Barber described it. And then there's the physics of the airplane, which one of the American pilots on the mission, Doug Canning, laid out plainly years later. The P-38G that they flew that day did not have the boosted controls of the later models. It was heavy on the ailerons, slow to roll. For Lanphier to have done what he claimed, to shoot a 0 off his nose, then roll inverted, come back around through a great arc, and arrived precisely behind and beside the fleeing bomber to make his deflection shot, all in the 20 or 30 seconds available before that bomber hit the trees, was, in the judgment of the men who actually flew that mark of lightning, very close to physically impossible. Put it together. The Rex says the killing fire came from behind. The wounds say the killing fire came from behind. The enemy witness says the attack came from behind and that Lanphier had peeled off toward the Zeros. And the aircraft itself says Lanphier could not have flown the maneuver he described in the time he had. Every independent piece of physical evidence points the same direction, and it points at Rex Barber. So how did the official record end up split down the middle? That is the part that ought to make you angry, and it is the heart of why we made this video. In the immediate aftermath, there was no proper debriefing. The pilots landed exhausted. The claims were written up in the confusion of victory, and because 3 separate men, Lanphier, Barber, and Holmes, each believed they had downed a bomber, the early tally credited 3 bombers destroyed. But there were only ever 2 bombers. The math was wrong from the first day, and nobody untangled it in the moment. Lanphier got credit for Yamamoto's bomber, and that credit, once written, was very hard to move. Over the following decades, as historians went back to the Japanese records and confirmed that only 2 bombers had fallen and that no Zeros had actually been lost at all, the official credit was adjusted. By the late 1970s, the Air Force's own victory credit study gave Lanphier and Barber 1/2 credit each for Yamamoto's bomber, splitting the single most consequential air-to-air kill of the Pacific War between 2 men as though it were a shared chore. In 1985, a formal Air Force Board of Review looked at the case again, but restricted itself to the original wartime evidence, the very evidence that had been muddled from the start, and it too came down on shared credit. Half and half. Rex Barber did not accept it, and he was right not to. In 1991, he petitioned the board that corrects military records, and this time, the fuller body of evidence was in play: the wreckage analysis, the autopsy, the testimony. The historians reconsidered the whole affair. R. Cargill Hall assembled the definitive scholarly volume on the mission, drawing in American and Japanese participants alike, and the case for Barber was laid out in detail. And still, in the end, the Secretary of the Air Force at the time, Donald Rice, ruled in 1993 to keep the credit shared. His stated reasoning was that so much time had passed and the memories were so tangled that certainty was impossible and that there was, in his words, glory enough for the whole team. In 1996, a federal appeals court declined to overturn that decision, ruling only that the Secretary had acted within his authority. The court did not weigh the evidence and fined for Lanphier. It simply declined to force the Air Force to rewrite its own books. And so it stands to this day. The official record of the United States Air Force still credits the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to 2 men, 1/2 each. That is the institutional verdict. That is the line in the file. But institutions are not the last word, and here is the piece of the story that is newest, and to me, the most powerful. One of the men who sat on that 1985 Board of Review, the board that came down on shared credit, was an Air Force historian named Daniel Hallman. He spent his career at the Air Force's Historical Research Agency. He knew this case as well as any living person. And only recently, in an article published in an Air Force magazine, Hallman looked at the wreckage evidence and the autopsy evidence one more time. The evidence that the fatal fire came from directly behind the bomber, and he did something that men on official boards almost never do. He changed his mind in public and put his name to it. He wrote that the evidence showed Yamamoto's plane was hit from the rear, consistent with Barber's account, and that Barber alone should have the credit for shooting down Admiral Yamamoto's plane. There was one place that did move. In 2003, the state of Oregon, Rex Barber's home state, formally recognized him as the man who shot down Admiral Yamamoto. A state legislature did what the United States Air Force would not. It is a strange and touching thing that a farmer and small-town mayor got his verdict from his neighbors rather than from the service he bled for. Oregon said what the file would not, and Barber by then was already gone. Think about what that costs a man to go back to a ruling you helped make decades later and say, we got it wrong, and I want the record to say so. The institution split the credit. The evidence, and now even a member of the very board that split it, says the credit belongs to one man. That is the case. Now you weigh it. I will tell you where I land, because I owe you that, and because ducking it would be its own kind of cowardice. I believe Rex Barber brought down Admiral Yamamoto. I believe the wreck, and the wounds, and the enemy pilot, and the physics of the airplane, and the historians who spent their lives on this, and the board member who reversed himself, All point at one man in one lightning firing from dead astern. The official record is a compromise, and a compromise is what you write when you lack the courage to follow the evidence. But you are the jury, and if you weigh it differently, the comments are open, and I will read them, because on this channel, the argument is the point. Now let me give the rest of the men their due, because a story that becomes only a lawsuit forgets the 15 other pilots who flew 1,000 miles over water and the one who did not come back, because there was a cost. Of the 16 Lightnings that reached Bougainville, 15 came home. One did not. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, the young pilot who had turned away with Holmes to nurse the stuck drop tanks and then plunged back into the fight, was last seen with his aircraft trailing smoke, and he vanished. He is believed to have gone down in the water. He was never found. The surviving Japanese pilot, Yanagiya, later thought he might have been the one who hit the Lightning that fell, though no Japanese airman ever formally claimed a P-38 that day. Raymond Hine is the name least spoken in this whole affair, and he is the only one who gave everything. When you argue over who got the credit, remember there was also a bill, and Hine paid it in full. And John Mitchell, the man whose navigation made every bit of it possible, the man without whom there is no interception to argue about, was treated by history almost as poorly as Barber. It was Mitchell who computed the impossible route, Mitchell who held the formation on the deck for 2 hours, Mitchell who arrived 1 minute early after dead reckoning across the open Pacific. In any just accounting, he is the central figure of the day. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the mission had leaked to the press, the secret behind it was too sensitive, and the recommendation was quietly reduced to a lesser decoration, the Navy Cross, because to fully honor the deed would have raised questions about how the Americans had known where to be. Mitchell went on to fly in the Second World War and later in Korea, ending his service with 15 aerial victories across the two wars. But ask most people who led the mission that killed Yamamoto, and you will get a blank look, or you will get the name of the man who talked the loudest. The navigator got the silence. That too is a kind of injustice, and it belongs in this story next to the other one. The two men at the center of the argument carried it to the end of their lives. Thomas Lanphier left the service a lieutenant colonel, moved through the aviation industry and public life, and told his version, the version in which he alone killed Yamamoto, on stages and in print until he died in 1987. Most of the obituaries printed his claim as fact, which must have been a bitter thing to read for the man in Oregon. Rex Barber stayed in the Air Force, was shot down again over China the following year and evaded capture on the ground, tested jet aircraft after the war, and finally went home to Central Oregon. He farmed. He served as the mayor of a small town called Culver, and he spent decades pressing, quietly and stubbornly, for the record to name him. He died in 2001. On his headstone, in a small Oregon cemetery, someone carved 2 P-38 Lightnings. He did not get the line in the government's file. He got the truth, and the men who study this know his name, and he got those 2 fighters cut into stone over his grave. It is not nothing. It should have been more. Besby Holmes, who fought the stuck drop tanks and came back to help finish the second bomber, lived a long life and died in 2006. He had been at Pearl Harbor on the day the war began, and he was there, over Bougainville, on the day the man who planned Pearl Harbor was brought down. There's a terrible symmetry in that, and Holmes carried both ends of it. As for the target, the Japanese search party reached the jungle crash site the day after the shoot-down, on April 19th. There is a famous account, passed down and repeated ever since, that they found Admiral Yamamoto thrown clear of the wreck but still upright, still strapped in his seat beneath a tree, a white-gloved hand gripping the hilt of his sword, his head bowed as if in thought. It is a powerful image, and I would be lying if I told you we can prove it. It comes from the recollection of the officer who led the party, and it served the purposes of a navy that wanted to remember its admiral as composed and unbroken even in death. Treat it as the Japanese chose to remember him, not as a verified fact. What is better established is that he had been killed by gunfire, that the wounds pointed backward toward a fighter on his tail, and that he was almost certainly dead before the bomber ever struck the trees. Japan hid the death for weeks. The nation was not told until May 21st, 1943, more than a month after the mission, when the announcement finally came that the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet had met a gallant death aboard a warplane while directing operations. He was cremated, his ashes carried home and given a state funeral on June 5th, 1943, an honor extended to only a handful of men who were not of the imperial family. He was promoted, after death, to the highest rank the Navy could give, and on the American side, the secret held. The men who flew the mission were told, in no uncomfortable terms, to keep their mouths shut about how they had known where to find him, and for the most part they did. The American public first learned that Yamamoto was dead only because Japan announced it, And even then, the true story, the broken code, the decrypted itinerary, the deliberate ambush stayed buried. It was not until after the war was over, in the autumn of 1945, that the full account came out and the world learned that the death of Japan's greatest admiral had been arranged by American cryptographers reading his own Navy's mail. Lanphier's loose radio call on the way home, the one boasting that the man would not dictate any peace terms now, could have unraveled the whole thing in a single afternoon. It is a small miracle, on top of the larger one, that the enemy never put it together. And the man who lived, Vice Admiral Ugaki, the one who rowed the second Betty down into the sea and survived, carried the war to its very last hour. He went on to command in later battles, and in the final days, he directed the kamikaze operations, the suicide attacks off Okinawa. And on the last day of the war, in the hours after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, Ugaki stripped the rank from his uniform, took up a sword that Yamamoto himself had given him, climbed into a dive bomber, and led one final suicide sortie out toward the American fleet. He did not come back. He had been shot down beside Yamamoto and lived, and 2 years later he flew out to die on purpose. The war took the whole of that command in the end, one way or another. What did the death of Yamamoto actually change? That is a fair question, and I will not oversell it because this channel does not deal in easy myths. Yamamoto was replaced by an admiral widely regarded as less able. Japan's most respected naval mind, the one man who had truly understood the enemy he was fighting, was gone. It is often said that Japan won no great victory at sea after his death, and that is true, but it is a correlation and not a proven cause. And I want you to hear the difference. The tide of the Pacific War had already turned before that morning over Bougainville. Midway was already a year in the past. The industrial weight of the United States was already coming down like a hammer. Killing Yamamoto did not win the war. What it did was remove the enemy's clearest-eyed strategist, strike a heavy blow to Japanese morale, and prove that American intelligence and American air power could reach out 1,000 miles and take the life of a single man at a single minute on a single morning. It was a message as much as a killing. The message was that nowhere was safe and that the Americans were listening. There is one more thing I want to leave you with, and it is the thing that has stayed with me through every account I have read of this mission, and I have read most of them. We tell this story as the death of an admiral, and it is that. We tell it as a feat of navigation, and it is that too, a feat that still astonishes the men who understand what dead reckoning over open water really means. But when I strip it all the way down, this is a story about a record, and about the distance between what a man does and what the file says he did. Rex Barber flew directly behind a bomber and fired the burst that killed the man who planned Pearl Harbor, and the official history of his own service still declines to say so plainly. John Mitchell threaded 16 fighters across 1,000 miles of ocean and arrived 1 minute early, and most people cannot tell you his name. Raymond Hine paid with his life and lies somewhere under the water off Bougainville, and he is the one nobody argues about, because there is no glory to divide, only a young man who did not come home. The men who fly the mission and the men who write the record are almost never the same men, and the gap between them is exactly where the truth goes to get lost. We make these videos to close that gap, one story at a time, to put the right name in the right cockpit and the right credit on the right grave, even when the file will not. This has been Air Command. If Rex Barber's story got under your skin the way it got under mine, then do the one thing that actually helps a channel like this survive in a place built to reward the loud over the true. Subscribe, so the next man who deserves his name back gets it. Tell us in the comments where you come down on the credit, Barber or Lanphier, because you have the evidence now and the jury is you. And if your family flew Lightnings in the Solomons or served with the 13th Air Force, leave their name below so that here, at least, in this small corner of the record, they are not forgotten. Keep your eyes on the sky. We will see you on the next one.